Hello everyone viewers. In a climate controlled vault in a cathedral in Turin, Italy, lies a single piece of cloth. It's 14 feet long, made of linen, and woven in a complex herringbone pattern to the naked eye. It appears unremarkable, faded, and scarred with burn marks from a fire centuries ago. But look closer. In the soft light, faint sepia tones resolve into a ghostly image. It is a man who was beaten, scourged, crowned with thorns, and crucified. For millions, this is the Shroud of Turin, the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. For skeptics, it's the most ingenious and successful forgery in human history. But what if it's neither? What if this simple piece of linen is something far stranger, a physical artifact that sits at the intersection of faith, science, and what if we are looking at a photograph, taken 2,000 years before the invention of the camera? An image seared onto cloth not by light, but by an event that shattered the laws of nature. This is not just the story of a relic. This is a cold case investigation, a forensic examination of the most famous execution in history, with the victim's body as the primary witness. And the testimony it provides is more. The story of the shroud as we know it erupts into the historical record in the mid-1350s, in the small town of Liry, France. A French knight, Geoffroy de Charny, puts the cloth on public display, claiming it is the true burial shroud of Christ. The pilgrims flock to see it, their awe and reverence palpable. But controversy is born in the same moment. The local bishop, Pierre, he writes a scathing report to the Pope, calling the shroud a work of cunning sleight of hand, a painting cunningly depicted, and claims to know the artist who created it, though he never names him. The battle lines were drawn in that instant, and for over 600 years, the war between belief and skepticism has raged around this silent piece of linen. For a time, the Church ordered it to be exhibited only. The faithful saw the face of their suffering Saviour, and no papal bull could convince them otherwise. In 1453, the de Charny family sold the shroud to the House of Savoy, the ruling dynasty of the region. The Savoys were its guardians for nearly 500 years. They housed it in a new chapel built specifically for it in Champfleury, France. And it was there, on a cold December night in 1532, the heat was so intense that the silver casket housing the folded shroud began to melt. A drop of molten silver fell, searing through all 48 layers of the folded cloth. Panic ensued. A local blacksmith, with the help of 2 Franciscan friars, broke through the iron grills of the chapel, snatched the smouldering casket, and doused it with water. The shroud was saved. When it was unfolded, they saw the damage, a series of large burn holes, scorch marks, and water stains, arranged in a symmetrical pattern down both sides of the image. The Poor Clare nuns were tasked with the repair. They stitched patches over the largest holes and sewed the shroud onto a reinforcing backing cloth, the Holland cloth, to preserve it. These scars, these wounds. In 1578, the Savoys moved their capital to Turin, Italy, and brought the shroud with them. And there it has remained, taking the name that it carries to this day, the Shroud of Turin. For centuries that followed, the shroud was an object of veneration, shown to the public on rare occasions. Its image, faint and mysterious, was studied by artists and contemplated by pilgrims. But its truth, as part of an exhibition of sacred art, the shroud was hung for public display. An amateur photographer and local councillor named Secondo Pia was given permission to photograph it for the first time. The task was daunting. The electrical lighting in the cathedral was poor and unsteady. Pia's first attempt at night failed. He returned 2 days later, on May 28th, for a second attempt. He set up his large. Later that night, in the dim red light of his darkroom, he submerged the 12 by -15-inch glass plate into the developing solution. He watched, expecting to see the familiar faint image appear in reverse, a ghostly white figure on a black background. But that's not what happened. As the image slowly materialized in the chemical bath, Pia stared in disbelief. He felt his heart pound in his chest. The dark hair and beard became light. The sunken cheeks filled out. The hollow eyes gained substance. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, someone was looking at the true face of the man on the shroud. Pia later said he almost dropped the plate in shock. He had just made the single most important discovery in the Shroud's history. The news was an explosion, a photographic negative centuries before the invention of photography. They paint what the eye sees. They could not, create a perfect negative image. The very concept was alien. This single discovery transformed the Shroud from a simple object of faith into a profound scientific paradox. It was a challenge thrown down to the modern age, a mystery demanding an explanation. As the 20th century dawned, the world began to look at the Shroud with new eyes. Scientists, doctors, and historians began to scrutinize Pia's photographs, and later, more detailed ones taken in 1931 by Giuseppe Enri. And what they found was a level of anatomical and forensic detail that was simply staggering. It was as if someone had taken the sparse, brutal accounts of crucifixion in the Gospels and created a complete, unflinching medical report. The man on the Shroud was not wearing the delicate circlet, like crown of thorns so often depicted in religious art. Instead, the blood flows on his forehead, scalp, and the back of his neck are consistent with a cap or helmet of thorns, something like the Ziziphus spina. Christi, a common thorny bush in the Middle East with long, sharp spines, the blood trickles down his forehead in rivulets. Medical experts identified these as coming from both venous and arterial punctures, a detail a medieval artist would be unlikely to know, let alone depict with such accuracy. The face itself is a mask of trauma. The right cheek is significantly more swollen than the left. The nasal cartilage is broken and skewed. There is a large contusion below the right eye. This is the face of a man who was beaten severely. They are dumbbell-shaped, small contusions paired together. These are the signature marks of the Roman flagrum, a terrifying whip designed not just to tear skin, but to pulverize the muscle beneath. It consisted of a handle with several leather thongs, each tipped with small pieces of bone or lead. The wounds cover his back, chest, and legs. By studying the angle of the lashes, forensic pathology, the savagery is methodical and absolute. This was not a token punishment. It was a scourging intended to bring the victim to the brink of death before the crucifixion even began. And then there are the crucifixion wounds themselves. This is where the Shroud offers its most compelling and disturbing evidence. Look at the hands, or rather, the wrists. The nail wound is not in the palm, as almost universal. A nail driven through the palm could not support the weight of a body on a cross. The flesh would simply tear, but a nail driven through the wrist locks the bones in place, providing the necessary support. This is a point of stunning anatomical accuracy, a detail that was only confirmed through modern medical experiments. How would a medieval forger know this, when every artist of his time got it wrong? Furthermore, the nail passing through the wrist would inevitably sever or damage the median nerve, causing the thumb to involuntarily contract and fold into the palm. This is an automatic physiological reflex, not something an artist would likely imagine. Then there is the wound in his side, a large oval-shaped wound between the 5th and 6th ribs on his right side. From this wound, a great flow of a darker substance this perfectly corroborates the unique detail found only in the Gospel of John. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. For centuries, this passage was a source of theological debate. What was this blood and water? Modern medicine has the answer. A spear thrust into this area would release this fluid. The water, followed by blood from the pierced heart or major blood vessels. The Shroud doesn't just depict this, it shows it with the clinical precision of a medical textbook. The blood flows on the Shroud are also forensically coherent. They are not artistic brushstrokes. They follow gravity. The blood from the wrist wounds runs down the arms at an angle of about 60. There are also secondary flows at a different angle, suggesting the victim had to push himself up on the nails in his feet to breathe, a ghastly see-saw motion of agony that was the central horror of crucifixion. Every wound tells a story. The scraped knees and abraded nose suggest a man who fell while carrying a heavy object on his shoulders, like the crossbeam or patibulum. This was a standard Roman practice called crurifragium, where the executioners would shatter the victim's legs with a heavy mallet to hasten death by asphyxiation. But the Gospels state that Jesus' legs were not broken in fulfillment of the prophecy about the Passover lamb, whose bones were not to be broken. The man on the shroud's legs are intact. What emerges is a portrait of a victim whose injuries match the Gospel accounts of Jesus' passion with a one-to-one correspondence, yet with a level of forensic detail that was utterly inaccessible to a medieval artist. The shroud was presenting a puzzle that art history couldn't solve. It was time for hard science to enter the cathedral. In 1978, the moment finally came. The owners of the shroud, the House of for 5 days and 5 nights, a team of 40 American and European scientists, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, was given round-the-clock access to the relic. The team was composed of physicists, chemists, medical examiners, and imaging specialists. Many of them were agnostics or outright skeptics, convinced they would quickly find the pigments and prove it was a painting. They brought with them 7 tons of cutting-edge scientific equipment, transforming the royal palace in Turin into a state-of-the-art laboratory. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. For 120 continuous hours, they subjected the shroud to a battery of non-destructive tests: ultraviolet and infrared spectroscopy, X-ray fluorescence, thermography, They took dozens of sticky tape samples from all over the cloth, lifting microscopic particles from its surface. And after 5 days of grueling, sleepless work, they packed up their equipment and spent the next 3 years analyzing the mountain of data they had collected. Their final conclusions, published in 1981, were a bombshell. The first and most important finding was unanimous. There is no paint. The team's chemists, experts in analyzing pigments, looked for substances like iron oxide, tempera, or other binders that a medieval artist would have used. They found them in trace amounts, likely from artists touching their painted copies to the original relic over the centuries. But on the image areas themselves, nothing. Zero. The image was not painted. Ray Rogers, the head of the chemist. This single conclusion obliterated the simplest, and for centuries, most popular explanation for the shroud. If it wasn't a painting, what was it? The team's analysis revealed that the image resides only on the very topmost microfibers of the linen threads. It doesn't penetrate the cloth at all. It has a thickness of only 200 to 600 nanometers, less than the wavelength of visible light. The image was caused by a chemical change in the cloth itself, a discoloration of the linen fibers, as if they had been artificially aged or dehydrated. It's a process chemically similar to the browning of a sugar when it's heated, a kind of caramelization. But it wasn't caused by heat in the conventional sense. A simple scorch from a hot object, like a branding iron or a heated statue, would have fluoresced. The shroud image, however, is perfectly uniform in its superficiality. It's as if a mysterious energy source acted at a distance, discoloring only the surface of the cloth that faced the body. But perhaps the most mind-bending discovery came from the image analysis experts on the team, John Jackson and Eric Jumper, physicists from the U.S. Air Force Academy. They took a high-quality photograph of the shroud image. This was a machine used by NASA to convert the light and dark shading of 2D photographs of planets, like Mars, into a 3D topographic map. When you put a normal photograph of a person into the VP-8, the result is a distorted, nonsensical mess. A photograph uses light and shadow, which have no relationship to the actual distance of the subject from the camera lens. But when Jackson and Jumper fed the shroud image, the nose was high, the cheeks were lower, the eyes were sunken, the data was all there. The darker the image on the cloth, the closer that part of the body was to the cloth. The image intensity was somehow inversely proportional to the cloth, body distance. This was something unheard of. It meant the image on the shroud was not a photograph or a painting, but a kind of distance map. How could this 3-dimensional information? They could describe what the image was, a superficial discoloration of linen fibers containing 3D data. But they had no answer for how it was formed, and there was one more piece of the puzzle: the blood. Microscopic analysis confirmed. It was real blood. Chemical tests showed the presence of hemoglobin and albumin, The blood type was later determined to be AB, a common. Furthermore, the blood contained extremely high levels of bilirubin, a substance produced by the liver when the body is under severe stress and trauma. And crucially, the STURP team discovered that the blood was on the cloth before. The image was formed under the bloodstains. The image is absent. This means a real bleeding body was laid in the cloth, leaving blood marks, and then, sometime later, this ruled out any theory of an artist simply painting a bloody body. The evidence was piling up, pointing towards something inexplicable. This level of detail is staggering. The science seemed to point in one direction, but the greatest scientific challenge was yet to come. A test that promised to solve the mystery once and for all, but instead plunged it into even deeper controversy. If you are finding this investigation after the STURP investigation, the pressure mounted for one final, definitive test, carbon-14 dating. For years the Vatican had resisted, fearing the destructive nature of the test, which required a piece of the cloth to be cut off and burned. But with the development of new accelerator mass spectrometry techniques, only a very small sample was needed. In 1988, the Church relented. On the 21st of April 1988, under the watchful eyes of the Archbishop of Turin, a team of experts and television cameras, a small strip of linen about the size of a postage stamp was cut from a corner of the shroud. This sample was divided into 3 and sent to the world's most prestigious radiocarbon dating laboratories: Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute. The world held its breath. 6 months later, in October 1988, Cardinal Balistrero of Turin held a press conference to announce the results. The verdict was delivered with cold, scientific finality. The 3 labs were in close agreement. The radiocarbon data showed that the linen of the Shroud of Turin originated between the years 1260 and 1390 AD, with 95% confidence. The date fit perfect, a medieval artifact. The headlines flashed around the globe: Shroud of Turin proven to be a hoax. Science solves the mystery of the Holy Shroud. For many, the case was closed. It was a brilliant, inexplicable forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. The centuries of debate were over, but were they? Almost immediately, questions began to arise about the validity of this. Was that small corner piece truly representative of the entire 14-foot cloth? Suspicions had been raised even before the test. The sampling location was chosen for being on the edge, away from the main image, to minimize damage. But this was also the area most handled by bishops and royalty, holding it up for display over the centuries. It was also adjacent to one of the patches sewn on by the nuns after the 1530. These were just theories, until a respected chemist from the original STURP team, the late Ray Rogers, decided to investigate. Rogers had in his possession sticky tape samples taken by the STURP team back in 1978, including some from the very area that was later cut for the carbon dating. For years, he believed the C-14 date was correct and had lost interest in the shroud. But in 2000, he took fibers from the main body of the shroud and compared them to fibers from the C-14 sample area. What he found stunned him and reignited the entire controversy. The fibers were not the same. The main body of the shroud was pure linen, but the fibers from the C-14 sample area were a blend of linen and cotton. The cotton had been skillfully interwoven with the linen in a technique known as French invis. Furthermore, Rogers found a plant gum and a dye, alizarin dye, on the C-14 sample fibers, used to color the newer cotton threads to match the aged yellow of the original linen. These substances were completely absent from the rest of the shroud. Rogers, the skeptical scientist, was forced into a shocking conclusion. The C-14 labs had not dated the original Shroud of Turin. A brilliantly executed repair that was invisible to the naked eye. He published his findings in a peer-reviewed chemistry journal, Thermochimica Acta, in 2005. Just before his death, he wrote, "The radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was not valid for determining the true age of the shroud." Rogers's work blew the case wide open. It suggested that the C-14 test, the single piece of evidence that pointed to a medieval origin, was fundamentally flawed. His findings were later supported by other statistical analyses of the raw data from the 3 labs, which showed that the C-14 dates were not as consistent as first reported, suggesting the sample itself was not homogeneous. The scientific community remains divided, but other scientists are now convinced the test was invalid. In recent years, new, non-destructive dating methods have been applied to shroud fibers. Several studies, using techniques like Raman spectroscopy and Fourier, transform infrared spectroscopy, which analyze the molecular degradation of linen over time, have all yielded dates far older than the C-14 test. One study by Italian scientists in 2013 dated the cloth to between 300 BC and 400 AD, a range that perfectly includes the lifetime of Jesus. These new methods are themselves controversial and not as established as carbon dating, but they add to the growing body of evidence that contradicts the 1988 result. We are left with a scientific civil war, a single powerful C-14 test on a now high. The anchor that had tied the shroud to the Middle Ages had been cut. It was once again adrift in the sea of the unknown, and so we are brought back to the ultimate question, the central mystery that has baffled the greatest minds who have studied it. How was the image formed? If it is not a painting, not a scorch, and not a photograph, what is it? Scientists have proposed dozens of theories, but none can account for all of the images. A bas-relief was coated with a substance and the cloth was pressed over it. This might explain the 3D information, but it fails to explain the superficiality of the image. A rubbing would deposit a physical substance on the cloth, and Stirp found none. It also can't explain the photographic negativity. What about the Maillard reaction theory? This proposes that vapors from a decomposing body, rich in ammonia, reacted with a thin layer of starch or saccharides on the cloth from the manufacturing process, causing the linen to darken. While this can create a similar discoloration, experiments have failed to produce an image with the high resolution, lack of diffusion, and perfect detail seen on the shroud. The process is too slow and too perhaps a body-shaped object, a metal statue or a bas-relief, was heated to a precise temperature and briefly pressed against the cloth. This could create a superficial scorch, but again, experiments have failed. A hot object creates an image that fluoresces under UV light. The shroud does not. A scorch also cannot replicate the 3D information accurately. The image This failure of conventional explanations has led some scientists to propose a more radical, and for many, a more profound hypothesis. They suggest that the image was created by a burst of energy, a form of radiation, that emanated from the body itself. This theory, often called the flash of light, or radiation theory, posits that at a specific moment, the body and the cloth emitted a powerful short burst of radiation. This burst of energy would have acted like a photographic flash, but instead of exposing film, it chemically altered the very structure of the linen fibers, causing the superficial discoloration. This process could, in theory, account for all of the shroud's mysterious properties. It would be a projection image, explaining why the detail is so high and not blurred. It would explain the superficiality, as the radiation would only affect the surface. It would also explain the photographic negativity, and it would explain why the image is not found under the bloodstains, as the blood would have acted as a shield, protecting the linen beneath it from the radiation burst. It is an elegant theory that fits all the known facts. The only problem, it requires a source of energy, a mechanism, that is completely unknown to modern physics. A dead body does not emit a burst of direction. The theory proposes a scientifically plausible mechanism for an event that lies outside of science. It suggests that the image on the Shroud of Turin is, in effect, a literal snapshot of the resurrection. This is a staggering claim, one that science can never prove or disprove. It leaves us standing on the very edge of what we know, peering into a mystery that may be beyond our comprehension. So, on the one hand, a linen cloth that forensics tells us wrapped a man who was crucified in exactly the manner described in the Roman Gospels, a cloth bearing an image with properties that seem to defy any known natural or artistic process. An image that contains three-dimensional data, as if it were a holographic projection. On the other hand, a single radiocarbon date, or a scientific enigma wrapped in a historical mystery. Believers see it as a silent witness to the central event of Christianity. Skeptics see it as the most brilliant and enduring piece of medieval art ever created, its methods still lost to history. Perhaps the truth is that the Shroud of Turin will never be a matter of definitive proof. It does not compel belief. Instead, it invites contemplation. It forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding, to ask what is possible, and to wonder about the events that transpired in a rock-hewn tomb outside Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Was the body of Jesus of Nazareth laid in this cloth? Was it a medieval artist of unparalleled genius who, for reasons unknown, created a masterpiece so forensically and scientifically advanced that it contains a silent artifact bearing witness to an event that lies at the intersection of history, faith, and of physics we have yet to discover? The final answer remains elusive, locked away in those ghostly sepia-toned fibers. The shroud asks a profound question of everyone who gazes upon it. What do you see when you look at the face of the man in the cloth? All right, that is all for today's video. If you like this